Today we're going to talk about Gestalt theory. Gestalt means the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. According to Gestalt, the brain is capable of organizing and structuring individual elements, shapes, or forms into a coherent, organized whole. Gestalt theory is a branch of psychology that was founded in 1910 by Max Wertheimer. Wertheimer was traveling on a train one day when he noticed that the flashing lights at a railroad crossing looked like the lights encircling a theater marquee. This prompted him to experiment with a toy called a zoetrope, which created motion pictures when strips of pictures were placed inside. This created an effect called apparent movement. Wertheimer noted that this apparent movement was not generated by the individual pictures, but rather by their dynamic interrelation. Wertheimer continued to research this phenomenon at the Psychological Institute in Frankfurt, where he met two other psychologists, Wolfgang Kohler and Kurt Kafka. These two men would become his lifelong partners, and together they founded Gestalt psychology. We are now going to discuss some of the Gestalt principles that are important to the design of instructional information. The first principle is figure ground. Figure ground explains how the limited information processing capacity of the human mind forces people to focus on one stimulus at a time rather than several. So, in figure ground, the figure is what you're paying attention to, and the ground is what you're not paying attention to. So in this example, we obviously have a picture of a white vase against a black background, and what we're paying attention to is the vase, right? Well, let's look at the black sections. It could actually be two faces against a white background, in which case the faces would be the figure and the white background would be the ground. It just depends on what you're focusing on. This image was designed intentionally to illustrate the principle of figure ground. Here's another example where, depending on what you're focusing on, this could either be a bunch of white horsemen against a black background or a bunch of black horsemen against a white background. The next principle is similarity. This has to do with the mind's tendency to group items based on similarity. In this case, what we have is a group of circles. So we have 6 rows of circles. But the mind is going to have a tendency to see 3 rows of black circles and 3 rows of white circles. So where similarity comes into play in designing instruction is that it establishes consistency and predictability. So for instance, when subject headings are consistently in similar locations, this should reduce cognitive load and make it easier to process information because it's not something different every time. This is probably my favorite principle, the principle of closure. This has to do with the mind's tendency to seek direction and to follow directional cues. So on the left, we have a picture of a triangle, right? Well, actually, if we're really taking it literally, this is just 3 little dark-colored Pac-Man shapes. But they create the illusion that there is a triangle there. Your mind sees the triangle. And then the panda bear, how do we know this is a panda bear? This could just be a bunch of black splotches. Well, your mind sees a panda bear. Your mind sees the contours that aren't really there because it's seeking closure. And as designers, closure is a helpful principle because, for one thing, this means that we can simplify our designs. We don't have to provide every single detail because the mind will fill in a lot of the details that aren't there. But also, we are encouraging learners to seek completion for themselves and to draw their own conclusions. The next principle is contiguity. This has to do with the mind's tendency to seek direction and to follow directional cues. So this could be done with arrows or directional symbols, or it could just be done with our design, with the shape of our design. If it looks like if it's going in a particular direction, if it looks like there's some movement, we can intentionally design things to cause our readers, our learners' eyes to go where we want them to go. So if I want them to see that leaf, my design is going to steer their eyes in that direction. Symmetry is defined as beauty of form arising from balanced proportion. So when you've got symmetry, you've got basically your elements in a design are centered. Now, in this example, this is just a perfect symmetry where if we were to fold this in half, each side would be a mirror image of each other. But symmetry doesn't necessarily mean that both sides are a mirror image. For instance, this famous painting that's called American Gothic is also a great example of symmetry. Even though the two sides are not mirror images of each other, they still have equal weight and they're centered. So this is a great example of symmetry, and it's a great example of balance, which is an aspect of Gestalt because it creates harmony. And finally, the principle of proximity. This has to do with the tendency of the mind to group elements based on their closeness to each other. So in this example, we have instructions on how to assemble a Lego set. Now, if you're like me, you've probably assembled a lot of these. Probably every Christmas for the last several years I've assembled a Lego set, at least one Lego set. And I really like the way that the instructions work because they have all the steps grouped together like this so that you can see the whole process, the whole Gestalt. You can see the whole process from start to finish, and you can also see the individual steps in the process. So this is a great example of Gestalt. And also, it just makes it a lot easier to follow when it's all grouped together. Can you imagine how much more difficult this would be if each step was on its own separate page? Just how easy it would be to get lost. Whereas when it's all together, you can see the big picture. You can see from the very beginning where this thing is going. So this is a great example of Gestalt. Well, that's it for my discussion of Gestalt theory. I hope you found this informative and perhaps even helpful in considering how you are going to design your own instruction. We'll see you next time.